There was a Texan who was out on vacation, and he was traveling around England. And he got into a taxi cab and was doing one of these cab sightseeing tours. And he passed by the Tower of London, and of course the cabbie was telling him, "Oh, this is the Tower of London. It was they started construction on that in 1346, and they finished it in 1412." And the Texan said, He said, "That's not very impressive." He says, "In Houston, we could have put something like that up in 2 weeks." Then they passed by the House of Parliament and that big building. And the cabbie said, "Well, we started this one in 1544, and it was finally finished in 1618. And of course, the Texan says, "Well, listen, in Dallas, we built a bigger one and better one than that in a year." And every time as they traveled through that he told him something, the Texan always had something bigger and better in Texas, and didn't take as long to build, but was quick. So they came to Westminster Abbey, and the cabbie didn't say anything. And the Texan thought for a minute, and he looked over at the cabbie, and he says, "Well, cabbie, what's that building over there?" And the cabbie looked over there, and he scratched his head, and he says, He said, "You know what? I don't know. It wasn't there yesterday." Take trips, go on vacations. Every year people take vacations, don't they? We're going to look today at the Jerusalem journey. The Jerusalem journey. For most of us, taking a trip, we go from one place here or another place, and we travel all around rather than stay at home. Of course, some people do stay at home for their vacations, but most of the time we take those trips. And I can remember as a boy making several yearly trips down to South Alabama, down to visit my grandparents and other relatives that were down there. And we always looked forward to it. It was really something that was very, very pleasant and everything else. And I guess because I really liked that, I kind of expected when I ended up with kids and had kids, that I expected my kids would get the same kind of thrill of visiting family and relatives and all. And you know, it didn't take me very long before I found out that they didn't care much for those type of trips. Instead, they liked those trips where you went to Disney World or King's Dominion or Myrtle Beach. That was fun. It wasn't fun for them to go visit relatives and family and friends. They didn't get the kick out of it that we did. But you know, back in Bible times, most of the people's relatives lived next door, so they didn't have to go visit their relatives. However, once a year, just about all of the Jews made a trip down to Jerusalem. Down to Jerusalem. They especially went on the Feast of Passover. In fact, for Jews, that was one of the things that it was almost anathema not to go. Passover. And where was it held? It was held in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the place to be. And Jesus himself made many trips there. In fact, Scripture seems to indicate that he went up to Jerusalem every year of his life at Passover. Every year. Luke chapter 2, verse 41, at least we know he did when he was a boy. It says this, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover. But why Jerusalem? Well, it is the capital city, and it is the place where the temple was. Still, its importance is much more than that. In fact, when it comes to salvation history, Jerusalem is the most important city in the world. The most important city in the world. Not by man's making it so, but because God made it so. You know, the Bible first mentions the city of Jerusalem in Genesis chapter 14, verse 18, but they called it Salem then. Salem, which means peace. And the full word Jerusalem, which means the peace of the Jebusites, because the Jebusites occupied that later on. The full word is mentioned in Joshua chapter 10 and verse 1, and then it is mentioned 762 more times in the Bible until you get to Revelation chapter 21 and verse 10. And Jerusalem makes a transition. The transition is that it no longer is talking about the earthly Jerusalem, but the heavenly Jerusalem. The city that we all want to go to. The city whose architect and builder is none other than God Himself and not man. The heavenly Jerusalem. Now, it was just outside the old city on Mount Moriah where God called Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son Isaac, and then stopped him just as the time that he had the knife in his hand. He stopped him and provided that substitute, the offering of a lamb. A ram. A ram became the substitute. And it was there that David later purchased the threshing floor of Araunah, where he offered up a sacrifice and a plague was stopped. And it was the spot that Solomon built the temple of God. It was where the Jews worshiped and where the Jews sacrificed to God. And it was also a place where many of God's prophets were killed, put to death. You know, one day when Jesus was going to Jerusalem, he looked upon the city with great sadness and lamented, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. But you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Jerusalem is a great city, the greatest on earth, because God made it the greatest and the most important. Now, God had been preparing from all of that ancient times. God had been preparing Jerusalem as the site where He Himself would offer the greatest sacrifice of all. It was where He would offer His one and only Son. He rejected Abraham's one and only son and substituted it for a ram. But He also substituted it with His own Son. with his own son. Listen, Jesus knew that he'd be killed in Jerusalem. And so as his time on earth was drawing to a close, Jesus once again headed toward Jerusalem. And you remember, where did he live? He lived over in Galilee. But once again, he headed for Jerusalem. But this time it was different. This time, he set his face resolutely to go up to Jerusalem. He was determined, he was going, and no one could stop him. He was going. And by the way, people did try to stop him, but he was going. This time, he knew it was his last visit. This time, he knew he was going up to Jerusalem to die. And his journey toward Jerusalem started shortly after Jesus had asked his disciples who people said he was. And we see Jerusalem as the most important city in the world, and we see Jesus as the most important man in the world. The most important man in the world. Because what did his disciples answer? They answered and said what people had been saying. Oh, you're one of the prophets, or you're Jeremiah, or you're... They gave quite a few answers. And then Peter said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then it says, from that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And I told you, people didn't like that. His own disciples didn't want to hear that. They're positive people. They didn't join the band to go die. They joined the band. They joined the discipleship. They came to Jesus because they expected Jesus to be their conquering hero, their Messiah, the one who would liberate Israel and bring them to fame again. This was their expectations. Peter, he didn't want to go and die. And he didn't want Jesus to go and die. Well, Peter didn't have to, but Jesus did. So Peter took him aside and he began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said. This will never happen to you. And then Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have the mind, or in your mind, the things of God, but the things of men. The things of men. You know, Jesus identified his assassins. He identified his assassins as the Jewish religious leaders. And he identified the place where his death would take place, Jerusalem. Jesus also told them that he would rise again on the third day. But Peter protested. I don't think he even understood what Jesus meant by rising on the third day. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. But you really don't have to die, Jesus. That was his argument. So Peter protested, "No, never." And Jesus responded, "Listen, Peter, your thinking is warped. You're not thinking like a spiritual man. You're thinking like a carnal man, a worldly man. You're thinking like the devil. You're thinking like Satan. The worldly man cannot see victory in dying. The worldly man thinks only of winning, of being the conqueror, being the victor, being the champion. For the worldly man, the only thing that counts is victory. It's not how well you play the game. It's not even about following the rules. Winning is not an option. Winning is all there is. It's the gold or nothing. Their protest, but Jesus, we signed up because we wanted to be on the winning team, not the losing team. Nobody wants to be a loser. To try to make them understand and remember, Jesus told them two more times. Two more times. In Matthew 17:23, they will kill him. On the third day he will be raised to life. And the disciples were filled with grief. Filled with grief when he had to tell him the second time. And it caused them a deep and great sadness and heaviness of heart. They just wanted to hear the good news. They didn't want to hear the bad news. The real problem was they saw the good news as something bad. They didn't understand what it really meant. You know, I used to have a problem understanding why in the world they called the Friday that Jesus died Good Friday. I couldn't wrap my brain around that for a long time. Of course, I also used to think that Black Friday must have been the day the stock markets crashed. Black day in history. Hey, listen, I'm not too bright. I still don't do well with negativity. They didn't. Jesus was telling them what was going to happen, and they didn't internalize it. They didn't let it get into their brain, into their heart. What happened was the same thing that happens to most of us. What happens when something goes on? Well, if we can't make an excuse for it, we try to ignore it or paint it a different color. We don't like to hear it. I have some real problems with don't liking to hear things. Matthew chapter 20 and verses 18 and 19 is the other time that he told them again. He said, we're going to go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They'll condemn him to death and will turn him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day, he'll be raised to life. He put a lot more into this one. It's the last one. What was going to happen? And here again, in my warped sense of thinking sometimes, I wondered, Jesus, why are you so insistent on going to Jerusalem? Why? If you know they're going to condemn you, if you know they're going to turn you over to the Gentiles to do their dirty work, the really painful work, Jesus, why? Jesus was predicting his death at the hands of men. And his death was the most important plot in the world. The most important city, the most important man, the most important plot in the world. Men have plotted an awful lot of things over the years, made plans, betrayed people. Oh, we as Americans, we have one fellow that we always remember, don't we? I think his name was Benedict Arnold. He betrayed. And we know Judas. He betrayed. But it's really, and of course, we look at the leaders of the Jews and we can blame them. And we look at the Romans and we can blame them. But the truth of the matter is, it's us. It's us. We're the ones who put him to death. We're the ones. By our sin, the sin that he died for. The plot seems to have started because Jesus was doing some healing on the Sabbath. In Matthew chapter 12, verses 13 through 14, then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other one. This was a man whose arm was just a half arm, we might say. It just did not grow like the other one. Completely restored, 2 arms the same length. But the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus. Why? Because he was healing on the Sabbath, of all things. Listen, we are the greatest fault finders in the world. All of us. We find fault with people for all kinds of things. You would think that we stay up half the night just thinking about how we can do it. But I know that's not really the case. But the point is, we are fault finders, and they were. They found fault in Jesus because he healed a man. Because of why? He did it on the wrong day. He did it on Sabbath. And then after that, they added blasphemy as a reason for putting him to death. In Luke chapter 5 and verse 21 it says, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Of course, we understand, we know. Jesus is God. Jesus can forgive sins. They didn't even realize what they were saying. But they were saying the truth. And Mark 11:18 tells us, "The chief priests and the teachers of the law heard this and began looking for a way to kill him. For they feared him because the whole crowd was amazed at his teaching." His popularity scared them, so they wanted to kill him. Have you ever been edged out in something, whether it be of the mind or of the body? Some kind of little contest, and maybe it wasn't even much of a contest. But have you ever been edged out? You lost, and you only lost by just a little bit. And have you ever thought, boy, I could kill him? That's the way they thought of Jesus. They were scared of him because he was popular, because he was afraid that they were afraid that he was going to edge them out. So they plotted to arrest Jesus in some sly way and kill him. In John 11, verses 47 through 50. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they ask. Here's this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away our place in our nation. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than the whole nation perish. When we look at Jesus' journey to Jerusalem from man's viewpoint, from man's perspective, from our standpoint, we see his disciples trying to stop him from going. And we see the Jewish leadership, the religious leaders trying to kill him, and the Romans doing the actual killing. And to someone just reading through the account as if it were just a book, Jesus may appear to be a helpless victim. You know, we could focus only on the meanness and the hatefulness of sinful man and those people and what they did. What they did. But listen, we also have to look at Jesus' journey from God's point of view and God's perspective. Jesus wasn't a helpless victim. Jesus chose to go to Jerusalem. Jesus chose to die there. Jesus chose to take upon himself the sins of the world. He chose to die so that we might live. Listen, Jesus really was betrayed, and he really died a horribly painful death. Why did he do it? He did it as an act of love and grace and mercy and kindness. He didn't have to. He did it because he loved the Father that much, and because he loves us that much. All of our plots and all of the things that mankind has done, Jesus could have stopped. But he didn't. He chose instead to take God's way and to die for us. In Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20, Joseph was dying